He married her to destroy her. But when the wedding dress is torn apart, not by him, but by the countless scars on her flesh, Cassian Vale realizes the real enemy was never this girl. And now, the very hand that once planned her destruction is the only thing standing between her and death. This is a story of revenge turned into salvation and love blossoming from the ashes of hatred. Like, comment the city you're watching in, so I know how far this story has come. Don't miss a second. The rain had been falling for 6 hours straight by the time Cassian Vale's motorcade turned off Interstate 5 and climbed toward the Moretti estate. 3 black SUVs moved in tight formation through the dark, headlights cutting across wet asphalt, the kind of convoy that made state troopers look the other way and made ordinary people forget what they'd seen. Cassian sat in the rear of the middle vehicle, jacket pressed, jaw set, eyes fixed on nothing in particular outside the rain-streaked window. His security chief, Marcus Drell, occupied the opposite seat and had the professional wisdom to stay quiet. Nobody spoke on the approach. Nobody ever did. The Moretti estate sat on 40 acres of manicured Pacific Northwest hillside. Every window lit like a lantern festival. The driveway already crowded with luxury vehicles from 3 different states. Reporters had been camped outside the iron gates since yesterday morning. Society photographers. 2 local news vans. Cassian had anticipated that. He'd wanted it. What he hadn't anticipated was the way his chest felt as the car slowed. Not anxiety. Something uglier than that. Something that lived closer to the bone. He was 34 years old, and he had spent 11 of those years building toward this exact night. Every deal made, every alliance forged, every rival quietly neutralized, every dollar routed through accounts the IRS would never find. All of it had been pointing here, to this rain-soaked driveway, to this moment. The Moretti name had been a splinter in his skull since he was 23 years old, sitting in a hospital waiting room in Baltimore while a surgeon explained what a man bled out from when 2 bullets went through his stomach, and that his father had felt very little pain at the end, which was something they said to families because it was easier than the truth. Cassian remembered thinking, very clearly, that he was going to make them pay. Not loudly, not messily, with patience, with something they couldn't shoot their way out of. Marriage, it turned out, was the cruelest weapon he'd found. The car stopped. Marcus said, "We're set." Cassian straightened his cufflinks, platinum, because details matter, and stepped out into the rain without waiting for an umbrella. The rehearsal dinner was held in the east wing of the estate, a converted ballroom that had been designed to impress foreign dignitaries and usually succeeded. Cascading floral arrangements in white and gold. String quartet in the corner working through something European and appropriately soulless. Moretti associates in tailored suits nursing whiskey and watching each other's hands the way men in that business always did. Cassian moved through the room like he owned it. He didn't yet, but he would. Dominic Moretti found him near the bar, already on his second drink, the old man's handshake firm in the way of someone who needed you to know it was still firm. Dominic was 67 and looked 55, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of face that belonged on a Senate campaign poster if you didn't know what the face had authorized over the decades. He smiled wide when he saw Cassian. "Son," he said, because Dominic Moretti called every man younger than him son and believed it communicated warmth. "Dominic?" Cassian accepted the handshake, matched the grip, released it exactly 1 beat early. A small thing. It registered. "You look good. Relaxed." Dominic flagged down a server for fresh glasses. "I was half expecting you to look like a man going to the gallows." "Why would I?" Dominic laughed, the sound of it too large for the room. No reason at all." He pressed a glass of single malt into Cassian's hand. "Tomorrow's going to be a beautiful day, whatever the weather does." Cassian took the glass and did not drink from it. "Where's Seraphina?" Something shifted behind Dominic's eyes. Subtle. Professional. The kind of micro-expression that most people would miss, and that Cassian had spent years learning to read the way other men learn to read balance sheets. "Getting ready, I imagine," Dominic said. "The women have her. You know how it is." "I'd like to meet with her tonight, before the ceremony tomorrow." "Cassian," Dominic spread his hands, smile still intact. "It's bad luck. I don't put stock in luck." Cassian met the older man's eyes and held them, and the smile behind Dominic's didn't move, but something behind it did. Tell her I'd like 5 minutes, privately. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to communicate that Dominic was weighing something. Of course, he said, I'll have someone bring her down. They gave him a sitting room off the main corridor, bookshelves full of books nobody had ever opened, oil painting of the cascades above the fireplace, fire burning low and orange. Cassian stood near the window with his hands behind his back and watched the rain move through the estate lights in the garden below. 11 years of patience, one more night. He heard the door behind him. When he turned, Seraphina Moretti was standing in the doorway wearing a deep blue dress and the careful, composed expression of someone who had been taught to wear expressions like armor since she was old enough to understand what they were for. She was 26 years old, dark hair loose around her shoulders, eyes the color of deep water, and about as readable. She was beautiful. He'd known that from photographs. It was irrelevant. What he noticed instead, the way she'd paused in the doorway before entering, scanning the room, the way a person checks a space before committing to it. Exits, furniture placement, where the other person was standing. The way she moved toward the chair he gestured toward, but sat at the edge of it, not back, weight distributed for fast movement. The way her hands folded in her lap with the deliberate steadiness of someone who had learned to make their hands stop giving them away. He'd expected defiance, or calculation. He'd prepared for both. He hadn't prepared for this. Mr. Vale, she said. Her voice was even. No excess to it. Cassian. He took the chair across from her, leaned back, crossed one ankle over his knee. A relaxed posture, deliberately chosen. He wanted to see if it made her more or less comfortable. The answer would tell him something. You can use my name. Cassian, she repeated without any particular weight attached to it. What did you want to discuss? Direct. He appreciated that, even if appreciation was a complication he hadn't budgeted for. Expectations, he said. I think it's useful for both of us to be honest about what this is. Something moved through her expression. Not surprise, more like confirmation of something she'd already suspected. My father tells me it's a merger, she said. Your father tells you what he needs you to believe. A silence. The fire popped. And what do you need me to believe? She asked. Cassian studied her. The composure was real, not performed. It had the quality of something built over time, mortared into place by repeated necessity. There were people who were calm because their lives had been gentle and calm, and there were people who were calm because they had burned through every other option, and calm was what was left. He was the second kind. He suspected, looking at her now, that she might be too. Nothing, he said. I don't need anything from you except your signature and your presence. What happens after tomorrow is a business arrangement. I intend to treat it like one. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. In another woman, that silence might have been a precursor to tears, or anger, or some other shape of protest. In Seraphina Moretti, it was something else entirely. It was a woman deciding how much of herself to reveal to a stranger who was about to own the legal rights to her name. All right, she said. Her hands didn't move. That's all you have to say? What would you like me to say? Cassian uncrossed his ankle, leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. Most people in your position would push back, ask for terms, make demands. Would it change anything? No. Then it would be a waste of time. She stood, smoothed the front of her dress, a gesture so practiced it was nearly automatic, and met his eyes once more. Is there anything else? He wanted to say yes suddenly, which surprised him. He wanted to ask her something true. He didn't know what. No, he said. That's all. She nodded once, moved to the door, paused with her hand on the frame, back still to him. Cassian, his name again, deliberate this time. I know what kind of man you are. I know what you've built, and I know why you want our name. A beat. I won't pretend it's anything else. I just ask that you remember I'm not the one who made the choices that brought us here. She left before he could answer. He sat in the firelit room for a long time after, listening to the rain. The ceremony the next morning drew 200 guests and 11 photographers, which was what Dominic Moretti wanted. The old man had always understood that public image was a kind of armor, That visibility purchased by a society wedding was a different and valuable kind of protection from the kind purchased by violence. Cassian understood this too, which was partly why he'd agreed to the spectacle. The larger and more legitimate the public record of this union, the harder it would be for the Moretti organization to simply make it disappear when things went bad. And things were going to go bad. Cassian had planned that too. The cathedral was full of white flowers and the sound of rain on stone. Cassian stood at the front and watched his soon-to-be wife walk down the aisle on her father's arm, and he thought about a phone call 11 years ago, the last words his father had said to him before the line went silent, and he let the cold fury of that memory sharpen him, the way he always did when he needed to feel nothing. Seraphina moved through the aisle like she was walking toward something inevitable, ivory gown trailing behind her, face composed into a kind of serenity that the photographers would call graceful and Cassian read as something else. She didn't look at the guests. She looked at him, not with longing, not with fear, with the same direct, measuring stillness he'd seen in the sitting room last night. He held her gaze. She held his. When she reached him, Dominic placed her hand in Cassian's with a smile that owned the room, and Cassian felt the dry warmth of her fingers through the lace of her glove, and they stood together in front of a man authorized by the state to bind their names together while rain pattered against the stained glass. The vows were traditional. Cassian said the words clearly, without inflection, without any of the performance that some men couldn't help adding. Seraphina said them in a voice like still water, precise, unhesitating, present. When the time came for the ring, Cassian took her left hand and slid the band onto her finger, and his thumb moved across the back of her hand, across the lace, and stopped. He felt it even through the fabric, raised texture, not the soft irregularity of knuckle or tendon. Something else. Linear. Deliberate. The specific topography of scar tissue. He didn't look up. He didn't change his expression. He was too practiced for that, and there were photographers and 200 witnesses. But his thumb traced the shape of what was beneath the lace, just once, very lightly, and something in his chest did a thing he hadn't accounted for. Old scars. Multiple. Thin ridges crossing the back of her hand. The wrist. He could feel it now, the glove tight enough to telegraph it, and then up, farther than he'd expected. He looked at her face. Her jaw was set, eyes forward. Nowhere on her face was there any indication that she felt his thumb, or that she knew what he'd found, or that anything was wrong at all. She was looking past his shoulder at some fixed point in the middle distance, and she looked like a woman who had learned to be somewhere else inside her own body when circumstances required it. The officiant said something. Cassian answered it. The ceremony concluded. He kissed her because it was expected, brief and formal, and he felt her exhale through her nose in the half-second before she stepped back. And the guests applauded, and Dominic Moretti beamed at the cameras, and Cassian Vale took his new wife by the arm and walked out of the cathedral into the rain with an entirely different calculus running through his head than the one he'd brought in. Blackthorn Manor was 4 hours north of Seattle, perched above coastal cliffs where the Pacific hit the rocks with a sound like collapsed architecture. Cassian had owned it for 3 years, had renovated it specifically for this purpose. A home that was also a containment facility, built with the kind of attention to detail that didn't announce itself. Security cameras in every corridor, reinforced doors on all exterior exits, guards stationed at the gatehouse and the cliff approach, men who worked for Cassian and answered only to him. The kind of estate that could be described in polite company as remote and exclusive. The kind that could be described in other company as inescapable. He brought Seraphina there in a separate vehicle from the reception, a deliberate choice. She sat across from him for the 4-hour drive and looked out at the darkening landscape and said almost nothing, and he watched her in the reflection of the window glass and thought about the scars under the lace. He had a file on Seraphina Moretti. He had files on everyone in the Moretti organization, built over years from paid informants, hacked communications, and one very well-placed accountant. Her file said she had been educated in Europe, that she had no close friends to speak of, that she appeared at public events perhaps 4 or 5 times per year, that she had never, in any documented communication, expressed any view about her family's business. The file said nothing about scars, which meant either his intelligence network had missed it, possible, or the scars were recent, possible, Or the scars were something the entire Moretti organization had been carefully protecting as a secret, and that possibility was the one his mind kept returning to, with the same dull, patient persistence of a tongue finding a broken tooth. They arrived at Blackthorn Manor after midnight. The staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew, Cassian's own people. Nobody with any loyalty to the Moretti name. The housekeeper showed Seraphina to her room. Second floor, east wing, the room Cassian had chosen because the windows faced the ocean and not the road, which was not an accident. He stood in his own room, tie already off, jacket over the chair, and poured 2 fingers of bourbon and did not drink it. Stood at the window and looked at the black shape of the ocean below the cliffs. Thought about his father, thought about patience, thought about the specific geometry of a scar left by something thin and deliberate, and how that was different from the geometry of an accident. He drank the bourbon. Then he went to the file on his desk and opened it to the photographs of Seraphina at a charity function 3 years ago, and he looked at the line where her evening gown met her shoulder, and he wondered what was underneath it, and he hated himself slightly for wondering, and he went to bed. The first week passed like weather. Cassian conducted his business from the manor's 4th-floor study, calls with his legal team, encrypted communications with the 2 federal contacts he maintained for situations like this one, the slow and careful work of beginning to dismantle the financial infrastructure that held the Moretti syndicate together from the inside. He was a patient man. He had always been a patient man. The satisfaction would come from watching it collapse in stages, watching Dominic understand what was happening to him, watching the old man's carefully constructed world come apart at the joints. Seraphina moved through the house. That was the most accurate way to put it. She moved through it like a presence that had no fixed address, appearing in the library in the morning with a book she didn't seem to actually read, walking the east corridor in the evening, sitting in the kitchen at odd hours drinking tea that had gone cold. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't complain about the guards or the locked exterior gates, or the fact that she had no phone that wasn't monitored by Cassian's security team. She didn't ask about the parameters of the arrangement, didn't ask when she might be allowed to leave, didn't ask anything that he had prepared himself to receive and deny. She was quiet in a way that made the manor feel quieter. On the 4th day, he passed her in the corridor outside the library, and she looked up from the book, actually looked up this time, not the performance of reading, and said, "The 3rd-floor bathroom has a leak. Behind the wall. You can hear it at night." He stopped. "I'll have it looked at." She nodded and went back to her book. On the 6th day, he came downstairs at 6 in the morning and found her at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug, still in the clothes from the night before, hair loose, an expression on her face that he caught for approximately 2 seconds before she heard him and rearranged it. In those 2 seconds, she had looked, not frightened, exactly. More like someone in the shallow end of surviving something. The way people look at 4 in the morning when the defenses are down and there's nothing left to perform for. He poured coffee. She didn't say anything. He sat at the opposite end of the table and opened his laptop, and they remained in that parallel silence for 40 minutes, which was its own kind of strangeness. He noticed she didn't eat breakfast. He noticed, thinking back, that she rarely ate meals at standard times. He noticed she had asked the housekeeper for extra blankets, 3 of them, despite the heating being adequate. He noticed he was noticing these things, and he didn't examine why. The screaming started on the 9th night. He was awake. He slept poorly away from the city, the ocean outside too loud and too steady, when he heard it from the east wing. Not loud. More like someone trying not to scream and failing partway through, the sound punching through sleep and the hallway and 2 closed doors before it reached him. He was out of bed before he'd made any conscious decision about it. He stood outside her door for a moment, listening, and heard movement inside, what's furniture scraping, which was strange, and then a sharp sound that might have been something falling, and then nothing. He knocked. Silence. "Seraphina," he kept his voice level. "I'm going to open the door." More silence. Then, very controlled. "Don't." The controlled part was what made him open it. It took more force than it should have, which was when he understood about the furniture. She'd barricaded it, nightstand and desk chair stacked against the handle, which took dedicated effort and which meant it wasn't the first time she'd done it. He pushed through and stood in the doorway, and in the low light from the hall, he saw her on the far side of the room near the window, facing him, wearing an oversized shirt that came to her thighs, arms wrapped around herself, breathing hard. She was awake. Fully, sharply awake, the kind that comes from adrenaline, not sleep. "I'm fine," she said, before he said anything. Her voice was the controlled voice, the one built from practice. "Bad dream. It's nothing. You can go." "What did you move the furniture for?" "A beat." "Habit," she said. He looked at her in the half-dark, at the arms wrapped around her midsection, at the way the oversized shirt moved over what were clearly bandaged ribs beneath it, and something cold went through him that wasn't the ocean breeze. "How long have you had that habit?" he asked. Her jaw tightened. "Since I was about 15? She said it flatly, like it was simply information, like it was the sort of thing people said. He should have gone back to his room. He knew that. He stood instead and looked at her and said, "Is there anything you need?" Something shifted in her face, too fast to catalog. "No," she said. "Good night, Cassian." He went. He lay in the dark of his own room for a long time after, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ocean, and thought about a 15-year-old girl barricading her bedroom door, and about the scars on her hands, and about the way she'd said "since I was about 15" like it was the answer to a question about a minor inconvenience. He thought about the file on his desk that apparently hadn't told him anything real about this woman. He thought about his father, dying on a marble floor while his son listened to the phone. And he thought about how those two things sat in his chest now, and whether they were supposed to be separate, and whether they still were. 11 days after arriving at Blackthorn Manor, Cassian was on a call with his financial attorney when he heard glass break on the second floor. He ended the call without explanation and took the stairs fast, Marcus 2 steps behind him. The sound had come from the east wing, her wing, and when they hit the corridor, he could already see the bathroom door standing half open, light on, and something on the floor that was dark and spreading. He told Marcus to stay in the hall. He went in alone. Seraphina was on the tile floor beside the tub, one arm braced against the porcelain, and the oversized shirt she always wore was rucked up on one side, and there was blood. Not a catastrophic amount, but real blood, dark against pale tile. And she was pressing a folded washcloth against her ribs, and when she heard him, she turned her face away so sharply it looked like it hurt. "Get out," she said, low and urgent and ragged in a way none of her other words had been. "Seraphina, get out." Her voice broke on it, not from grief, from something closer to shame or humiliation or the specific terror of being seen. "Please, please just let me see." "No." She was pressing harder on the cloth, and he could see her hand shaking, which was the thing that made him cross the room and crouch beside her on the cold tile. She flinched back against the tub. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. He said it the way you say something when you understand suddenly that it needs to be said. "You don't know what you're looking at," she said, still turned away from him. "Then show me." A silence that stretched, her breathing audible and unsteady, the ocean beyond the cliff wall doing what it always did. He waited. She turned back to him, finally. Let him see her face, which had the undone quality of someone who has been trying very hard for too long and has run out of capacity for it in this particular moment. Then, slowly, she lifted the edge of the shirt. He had seen violence. He had been adjacent to it his entire adult life, and he had seen what it left on bodies. He was not a man who turned away from difficult realities. He turned away for a moment now. Not from her, he needed a second, just 1 second, to put his face somewhere she couldn't see it before he could control it. Then he turned back. The scars covered the left side of her torso from her ribs to the curve of her hip. Old ones, silvered and raised, the clean lines of knife wounds. Others that were textured differently, round and puckered. Burn marks. Cigarette burns, by the size and pattern, and enough of them to indicate that someone had taken considerable time with it. The wound currently bleeding was a reopened older injury along the lower rib line, not deep, the kind of thing that opens under physical stress. "Who did this to you?" Cassian said. It wasn't quite a question. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." She looked at him then, really looked, and in her expression there was something that might have been gratitude and something that might have been grief and something that was just bone-deep exhausted wariness. Why? He didn't have an answer for that, not one he was prepared to give her, so he said, "Let me help you with this," meaning the bleeding, meaning right now, this immediate problem on the tile floor. She was still for a long moment, then she nodded. He opened the cabinet under the sink and found the first aid kit that was in every bathroom of every property he owned. He cleaned the wound with the steady impersonal efficiency of a man who had patched worse, and she sat against the tub and stared at the opposite wall and didn't make a sound. When he pressed gauze against the site and held it there, she exhaled once, something that was almost a shudder, and then controlled it. "You have guards outside your family's property," he said, working. "You've had them your whole life." "Yes, and none of them, they work for my father," she said, as though that answered it. Which, he was starting to understand, it did. He secured the dressing and sat back on his heels and looked at her, and she was looking at her own hands in her lap, the lace-gloved hands he'd held yesterday and the day before at whatever dinner or joint appearance had been required, and he thought about the scars under those gloves. "Seraphina," he said, "what happened to you in that house?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wasn't going to answer. "What always happens," she said finally, voice quiet and even, and absolutely devastating in its flatness, "when you're born into the wrong family and you're not the right kind of useful." She stood up before he could say anything, pulling the shirt down, and she looked at him once, just once, direct and clear, and carrying everything she'd just said. And then she walked out of the bathroom and down the hall to her room, and he heard the furniture scraping against the door. Cassian remained on the cold tile for a long time. He was thinking about Dominic Moretti's handshake, about the carefully composed file that had told him everything about Seraphina's public appearances and nothing about the private ones, about 11 years of planning and the clean architecture of revenge, and how all of it looked different now, sitting on a bathroom floor next to blood and a first aid kit, from how it had looked in the sealed and certain darkness of his own grief. He was thinking that he had come here to destroy this family, and he was starting to understand with the slow and terrible clarity of a man who has just walked through a wrong door that there were people in this family who had already been destroyed. The question, the one he hadn't been prepared for, the one that was going to change everything, was what he intended to do about that. 3 days later, his investigator sent him a file. Not the curated, publicly accessible profile that his intelligence network had assembled over years. Something new. Something that had taken 6 months to reconstruct from deleted records, sealed court documents in 2 jurisdictions, and the testimony of a former Moretti employee who had relocated to another country and still spoke about it in a whisper. Cassian opened the file at his desk at 2 in the morning with the ocean outside and the manor quiet around him, and he read it straight through without stopping. When he finished, he closed it. He sat very still in his chair. Then he picked up his phone and called his investigator back. "The brother," he said, "Lucien Moretti. I want everything you have. Everything. I want to know what he was doing 11 years ago in October, and I want the documentation to prove it, and I want it in my hands by Friday." A pause on the line. "Cassian," his investigator said carefully, "if what I'm finding leads where I think it leads, then find it anyway," Cassian said, "and don't call me until you have the proof." He hung up. He looked at the closed file on his desk. He thought about his father. He thought about Seraphina Moretti asleep down the hall behind a barricaded door, carrying on her body the record of what her family had done to her. And he thought about the fact that the man he had spent 11 years blaming for his father's death might not be the man he thought he'd been blaming. The floor had just shifted under the architecture of everything he'd built, and somewhere in the wreckage of that, in the space where his certainty used to live, something else was starting to take shape. Something dangerous and inconvenient and completely outside the plan. Something that felt, to his considerable alarm, like the very beginning of care. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources. The file arrived on a Friday at 11:47 p.m. Cassian heard his phone vibrate against the desk and knew from the pattern, 3 short, 1 long, that it was his investigator. He'd been waiting for 4 days. He'd told himself he wasn't waiting, that the work he was doing in the study each evening was simply work, that the quiet meals he had started taking in the kitchen rather than his private dining room had nothing to do with the woman who now appeared reliably at the table around 8 o'clock with her cold tea and her book, that none of it was waiting. He picked up the phone. The file transfer took 40 seconds. It was 63 pages. He read it standing at the window with the ocean black and indifferent below the cliffs, and by page 12 his jaw was tight, and by page 29 He had sat down without noticing. And by page 44 he understood, comprehensively and irreversibly, that the architecture of 11 years had been built on a floor that wasn't there. His father had been killed during what the Moretti syndicate believed was a legitimate peace negotiation. That was the history he'd carried. Dominic Moretti had ordered it, or authorized it, or looked away while it happened. That was what he'd believed, what he'd built everything around. The file said something different. The order had never come from Dominic. Lucien Moretti, 39 years old now, the eldest Moretti child, the heir apparent with his tailored suits and his political contacts and his smile that arrived slightly too late to be genuine, had been 28 years old when he made the call that sent 2 men to intercept Cassian's father in a Baltimore parking garage. He had done it without his father's knowledge, without the syndicate elder's authorization. He had done it to collapse a peace deal that would have limited his own private operations, arms trafficking routes that moved through 3 different ports, and that Dominic, an old-school operator who had his own rules about what was acceptable, didn't know existed, and would have shut down if the peace held. Cassian's father had died to protect Lucien Moretti's side business. And the syndicate, Dominic, the elders, the entire Moretti organization, had been told it was a veil provocation. They had believed a lie for 11 years, and Cassian had believed a different lie for 11 years. And somewhere in the middle of those 2 lies, a man had bled out on cold concrete while his son listened to the phone, and the person responsible had gone on to expand his trafficking operation to 4 additional ports and 2 overseas partners, and had, in the interim, done something to his younger sister that left her barricading her bedroom door at the age of 15. Cassian put the phone down on the desk. He sat in the dark and the sound of the ocean for a long time. Then he got up, went to the wet bar, poured bourbon, and drank it, and poured another. Then he put the glass down because he needed to think clearly, and drinking wasn't going to give him that. He thought about what you do when the target has been wrong the entire time. He didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. What he had was 63 pages of documented evidence and a rage so clean and structural it felt almost architectural, like something that had been redesigned from the foundation up. He didn't sleep. At 6 in the morning he was in the kitchen when Seraphina came down, and she stopped in the doorway when she saw him. He was usually upstairs by the time she appeared, and for a moment she simply assessed him the way she assessed all spaces before entering them. Whatever she read in his face made something shift in hers. She came in anyway, filled the kettle, moved around the kitchen with the careful efficiency of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. "You look like you haven't slept," she said, not looking at him. "I haven't." She set the kettle on and turned around, leaning back against the counter with her arms folded. She was wearing the oversized shirt again, the one she seemed to sleep in. Her hair was loose, and there were shadows under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept particularly well either. "Business?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Of a kind." She watched him for a moment. "Do you want to tell me what kind?" He looked at her. As the woman he had married to punish her family, who was standing barefoot in his kitchen, having earned nothing he'd intended to take from her. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer it honestly." Something in her expression closed slightly, a careful preparation. "All right." "Lucien," he said. Her reaction was immediate and total, and she controlled it in under a second, jaw, shoulders, hands, but he saw all of it in that single second, and it told him more than the 63 pages had. "What about him?" she said. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it now. "What did he do to you?" A silence. The kettle beginning to build toward boiling, a low metallic sound. "Cassian, I've read things," he said. "Not about you specifically, about his operation. I need to know how much you know about what he does, and I need to know what he did to you, and I'm asking you directly because I think you're the only person in your family who will tell me the truth." She looked at him for a long time. Something complicated moved through her face. Calculation, yes, but also something rawer than calculation. Something that looked like the preliminary stage of a decision that had been a long time coming. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She poured the tea and set a cup in front of him even though he hadn't asked for it. And then she sat across from him and wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked at the table between them. "When I was 16, she said, I found a ledger." She said it the way you start with the fact that can be stated clearly before moving to the ones that can't. Not my father's, Lucien's. He kept it separately, which I didn't understand at the time. I didn't understand most of what was in it. But there were names and numbers, and some of the names I recognized from things my father had said. Names he'd said as being settled, as being done, debts resolved, people who'd been paid off or retired. A pause. Except they were in Lucien's ledger with dates that came after my father's dates. Different transactions, different purposes. Cassian didn't move. I showed my father, she said. I thought that was the right thing to do. I was 16, and I thought that was the right thing to do. She looked up at him then, briefly. It wasn't the right thing to do. He understood then what that meant from the way she said it, the particular weight of a lesson learned at a cost that couldn't be recovered. Lucien found out I'd told him, she said. My father confronted him and Lucien denied it, and my father chose to believe him because… She stopped, exhaled, continued. Because Lucien was the heir and I was a daughter, and those things have a very specific relative weight in my family. And I'd known that my entire life, but I suppose I'd hoped it would count for something in a crisis. It didn't. She looked at her hands around the cup. After that, Lucien made sure I understood the consequences of talking about things that weren't my business. He was very thorough about that lesson. He took about 2 weeks to be thorough. The kettle had long since finished boiling. The kitchen was very quiet. How old were you? Cassian said, and his voice came out lower than he intended. 16. I told you. And your father believed I'd injured myself, she said, or chose to believe it. I've stopped being certain which is true. She turned the cup slowly in her hands. After that, I was more careful about what I looked at and what I said, and mostly about what I could prove before I opened my mouth. She looked at him steadily. I was careful for 10 years, and then you came along, and my father sold me to you like an asset, and here we are. Cassian looked at her across the kitchen table and thought that he had spent 11 years building a revenge apparatus against people who had, as it turned out, varying degrees of culpability for what had happened to him, and that the person sitting across from him had been collateral damage in a war she hadn't started and hadn't deserved and hadn't been able to get out of, and that he had compounded that damage by bringing her here. 4 years ago, he said, there was a man in Lucien's organization. His name was Petrov. He disappeared. Something went very still in her face. You know about that, he said. Her hands on the cup were not moving. Not white-knuckled, not shaking, just very deliberately, carefully, not moving. What do you know? She said quietly. I know Petrov was one of Lucien's operations managers. I know he was running the northern port routes. I know he stopped appearing in any documented record as of January 3 years ago. He paused. My investigator thinks he was killed. He hasn't been able to confirm it. Seraphina's jaw was very tight. Seraphina, Cassian said. Did you witness something? A silence that was its own kind of answer. I need to know, he said, what I'm dealing with, what he's capable of. I know what he's capable of, she said, and her voice had gone quiet in a way that was entirely different from composure, a flatness that came from something having been burned away. I've known what he's capable of since I was 16 years old. She looked up at him. Petrov wanted out. He'd found something he didn't want to carry anymore. I don't know what specifically. He came to my father to arrange terms. He didn't know that Lucien was listening. She stopped. I was in the East Library. The room connects to the study by a passage that hasn't been used since my grandmother's time. I heard everything. Cassian waited. Lucien had him taken from the house that night, she said. The men who came for him were Lucien's, not my father's. My father was told Petrov had run. That was the story. She set her cup down with the careful precision of someone placing something fragile on uncertain ground. I saw them take him. Lucien saw me see them. She met Cassian's eyes. That's the most recent set of scars. Cassian sat with that. He knows you're a witness, he said. Yes. Then the question isn't whether he's planning something, Cassian said. The question is when. He called Marcus up from the gatehouse that afternoon and spent an hour restructuring the manor's security protocols, additional cameras at the cliff approach, a secondary communication system that ran off a separate encrypted network, arrangements with 2 former military contractors he trusted more than most people alive. Marcus listened, made notes, asked 2 precise questions, and went to execute without commentary. It was one of the things Cassian valued most in Marcus. The man understood when questions would waste time. He also made 2 calls he didn't tell Marcus about. The first was to a federal contact in Seattle, a woman named Reyes who occupied a specific position within a specific agency and who Cassian maintained a relationship with on the mutually beneficial understanding that he fed her information she couldn't obtain through official channels, and she occasionally allowed certain operations of his to proceed without excessive scrutiny. He told Reyes he was developing something significant on a domestic organized crime figure and that he needed to know the current status of any active investigations adjacent to the Moretti family. She told him there were 2, both stalled for lack of physical evidence, one of them specifically targeting Lucian's port operations and stuck behind a wall of political protection that reached into 2 congressional offices. He told her to keep those cases warm. The second call was to his attorney, who he instructed to begin the process of establishing Seraphina's legal standing independent of both the Moretti family and their marriage contract, a process that would need to move quietly and could not leave a financial trail pointing back to Cassian until he was ready for it. He was beginning to understand that the plan he'd arrived with was no longer operative. What he was building now was different, still patient, still deliberate, but no longer about punishment. They ate dinner together that night without planning to. She came down at 8, he was already there, and some unspoken negotiation occurred where they both sat down and the housekeeper brought food and nobody said anything for a while. It wasn't the silence of the first week, which had been opaque and defensive on both sides. It was the silence of 2 people who have exchanged something significant and don't yet know what to do with the aftermath. "What do you do," Seraphina said eventually, "when you're not running whatever it is you run?" He looked up from his plate. "What makes you think I do anything else?" "Everyone does something else. The people in my family did woodworking, collected watches. My father grows orchids." She said this last with a neutrality that did nothing to conceal what she thought of it. There's always something else. Cassian thought about it. "I build things," he said it. "Structures. I have 3 properties I've renovated from the frame up. I like knowing how things are put together." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the preliminary shape of one. "Of course you do. What about you?" She looked at her plate. "I used to paint," she said. "When I was a child. My mother painted. She was good. Genuinely good. Not the kind of hobby that gets called a gift to be polite. She died when I was 9, and my father kept her canvases in the East Wing studio. I used to go there." She paused. "Lucien had the studio converted to a secure room when I was 18, for storage," he said. Cassian looked at her. "I'll get you materials," he said. "Tomorrow." She looked up, and the expression on her face was something he hadn't seen there before. Not the composure, not the careful assessment, not the controlled pain. Something simpler than all of those. Something that was almost surprise and almost wasn't, because he was beginning to understand that surprise was a luxury she'd learned not to carry. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'll get them tomorrow." She looked at him for a moment longer than was necessary. Then she nodded once and went back to her food, and across the table the almost smile had settled into something quieter and more real, and Cassian looked at his own plate and felt the specific and inconvenient warmth of having done one small right thing in the middle of a great many complicated wrong ones. The painting supplies arrived the next afternoon. He'd had Marcus source quality materials from a Seattle art supplier, canvases in 3 sizes, proper oil paints, and not the amateur set. Brushes his research suggested were appropriate for the style his investigator's supplementary file had mentioned Seraphina's mother had used. He left them outside her room without comment. He didn't see her reaction. He was on a call with his financial team. What he found, at 10 o'clock that night when he passed her room on his way downstairs, was that her door was open. For the first time since she'd arrived, fully open, no furniture barricaded, and she was sitting on the floor against the bed with a small canvas propped against the nightstand, and a brush in her hand and paint on her forearm where she'd bumped something, and she was entirely absorbed. The careful stillness she usually wore replaced by something looser and more unguarded. She hadn't heard him in the corridor. He stood there for approximately 3 seconds. Then he kept walking, and did not examine why his chest felt the way it did in those 3 seconds, because that particular examination was not one he was ready to have. 9 days later, Cassian Moretti called his sister's monitored phone. Cassian was in the security room when the call came in, watching the feed log, and he put on the headset without hesitation. Lucian's voice was warm, cultured, the voice of a man who had grown up understanding that charm was a tool with better reach than a knife in certain situations. He called her by a childhood nickname. He asked how the new arrangement was treating her. He made 2 jokes about Cassian's reputation that were phrased as jokes, but were not jokes. Seraphina's voice on the other end was the composure voice, the armor voice, and Cassian found himself listening to the particular quality of it with a newly specific understanding of what it cost her. "You sound well," Lucian said. "Better than I expected, honestly." "I'm fine," she said. "Good. That's good." A pause that had weight in it. "You know, we're having a family dinner next month. Father wants everyone together. I think it would mean a lot to him to see you." "I'll check with Cassian," she said. "Of course." Another pause. "Seraphina." His voice dropped slightly, a register that communicated privacy, intimacy, the particular warmth of family. "You haven't said anything, have you, to him, about family business?" The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Cassian counted them. "Of course not," she said. "Why would I? No reason? I just want to make sure you're comfortable, that you feel like you can be yourself there." A breath. "Because you know how I worry about you. You've always been—" Another pause, theatrical in its weight. "My most important concern." "I know," she said. "Good." The warmth back in full. "Give my regards to your husband. Tell him I look forward to getting better acquainted." The call ended. Cassian took off the headset. He sat very still for approximately 30 seconds, thinking about the specific information in Lucian's call. The family dinner, the veiled threat dressed as affection, the careful inquiry about what she might have said, the tone of a man taking the temperature of a situation he was managing. He was already moving. Cassian Moretti knew something had shifted. He didn't know what. But he was the kind of man who, when he sensed movement in a situation he was supposed to control, acted preemptively. Cassian recognized this because he was the same kind of man. He went upstairs. Seraphina was in her room with the door open again. She'd been leaving it open for days now, which was something he hadn't commented on because some things were too fragile to name directly. She was at the small desk near the window, not painting, just sitting, and when he appeared in the doorway, she turned and whatever was in his face made her straighten immediately. "He knows," she said, not a question. "He suspects." Which in his case amounts to the same thing. She stood, her hands were at her sides and she was very still, and Cassian watched her process it. The way the composure settled in, yes, but also the way something underneath it went alert, not panicked, not brittle, but alive in the way of someone whose survival instincts were very old and very practiced. "What are you going to do?" she said. "Move first," he said. "I've been building toward a federal case. Evidence of trafficking operations, political corruption, the murder of 3 documented witnesses, including Petrov. I can accelerate the timeline." "How much time do we have?" He looked at her. "I don't know. I don't know if it's days or weeks." She nodded, a single deliberate movement, and something in her expression did something he hadn't seen before. Something that wasn't composure exactly. Something that was composed but not constructed. A steadiness that came from somewhere real rather than being placed there for effect. She looked at him and she said, "Then tell me what you need from me." He was not prepared for how much that cost him. The simple directness of it, the trust implied in it from a woman who had every reason not to extend trust and who was extending it anyway. "Your testimony," he said, "about Petrov, what you witnessed, on record with federal investigators. It's the piece I don't have documentation for." The thing that moved through her face then was complicated and not brief. He watched her reckon with it, what it meant, what it would cost, what it would take to say it out loud to a federal investigator in a room where it became real and permanent and irrevocable. "All right," she said. "Seraphina, you understand what you'd be—" "I understand," she said. Steady, not loud. I've understood for 3 years what I saw. I've been waiting for a reason. She looked at him directly. You're the reason. Cassian held her gaze. He should have said something practical about the timeline or the process or the security measures he was putting in place. He should have kept this in the register of a coordinated operation and not let it become what it was quietly becoming, which was something else entirely. I'm going to get you out of this, he said instead, and he said it with a certainty that was not performed. She looked at him. Something in her face that was fragile and real and alive. I know, she said, and in her voice was the specific sound of someone who has never once in their life said those words to another person and meant them. He had his investigator send the Petrov documentation to Reyes at 6 the next morning. He spent the afternoon in a 3-hour encrypted call with his attorney, constructing the legal architecture that would carry Seraphina's testimony into the federal record protected and unimpeachable. He moved the timeline up by 30 days and told Marcus to double the gatehouse watch and to source 2 additional personnel who were to be stationed at the cliff approach around the clock. He was being careful. He was being as careful as he knew how to be. He was not careful enough. Because at 9:47 the following night, as Cassian was encrypting the final evidence package for transmission to Reyes, his security feed showed 3 things in rapid succession. The gatehouse camera going dark, the motion sensors on the North Cliff approach going active, and then, 7 seconds later, the East Wing corridor camera showing 4 men in tactical gear moving towards Seraphina's room. Cassian was already running when the first shot broke the window at the end of the hall. The manor lit up like the detonation, not with fire, not yet, but with noise and chaos and the specific high-pitched crack of weapons in an enclosed space. And somewhere in the East Wing glass was breaking, and men were shouting, and Cassian hit the second-floor landing with his own weapon drawn, Marcus behind him, 3 of his security team moving up from the ground floor. He fought toward her room. He took a round in the left arm that punched through the muscle and kept going, which he registered and filed away because there wasn't time for pain right now. There was only forward. He put 2 of Lucien's men down in the east corridor and kicked the door open, and the room was empty. Bed thrown back, small canvas still propped against the nightstand with fresh paint on it, window open, curtain moving in the dark coastal wind. Gone. Not hiding. Gone. He moved to the window and looked out at the cliff approach and saw, 40 yards away and moving fast, a vehicle he didn't recognize with its lights off heading toward the coastal access road. And he saw, in the vehicle's rear window, the outline of a figure that was not moving freely. Cassian stood at the window with his wounded arm bleeding into his shirt, and the October wind off the Pacific cutting through the broken glass. And the calculation that moved through him in the next 3 seconds was cold and total, and left no room for anything except the single directive it produced. He turned from the window and said to Marcus, already behind him, "Get the car. We're going after them." "Cassian, your arm. Get the car." Marcus went. Cassian reloaded, checked the clip, chambered around. His arm was burning in a way that would need attention eventually. He didn't give it attention. He moved to the door, and as he passed the nightstand, he saw the small canvas. Still wet, landscape of some kind, ocean and cliffs, and a strip of something that might have been light on the horizon. And he did not let himself look at it for more than 1 second, because if he looked at it for more than 1 second, it would mean something he wasn't capable of carrying right now. He went to the corridor, Marcus's voice came from his earpiece. "Car is ready, North Gate." "What's the vehicle's direction?" "Coastal Highway heading south." Cassian, Marcus paused, and in the pause there was something specific and serious. "The vehicle is heading toward the city, toward the cathedral." Cassian stopped walking. Of all the things Lucien could have chosen, the cathedral was the one Cassian understood immediately and viscerally and completely. The location of the marriage, the beginning of the story he had engineered, the place where Cassian's name had been tied to the Moretti name in front of cameras and witnesses. The cathedral was Lucien saying, "I'm going to end this where it started, and I'm going to make sure everyone who is watching at the beginning is watching at the end." It was also Lucien saying, "I know you'll come, and I want you to." Cassian knew it was a trap. He ran toward the North Gate anyway. The coastal highway ran south through darkness and sea spray, and Cassian drove it the way he drove everything when the situation demanded it. Fast, precise, Both hands on the wheel, despite the left arm that was seeping through the makeshift pressure bandage Marcus had tied off in 40 seconds at the north gate. Marcus was in the passenger seat running communications, two-handing his phone, relaying positions between the tail vehicle behind them and the security team he'd scrambled from Seattle contacts. His voice was clipped and operational, and Cassian was grateful for it because it filled the space where his own thoughts were trying to do something he couldn't afford right now. "Vehicle is confirmed heading into the city," Marcus said. "Lost visual on the 14 interchange. My guy on the ground says it went north on Meridian." "Toward the waterfront," Cassian said. "Toward the cathedral." The cathedral sat on a block of older Seattle real estate that the Moretti family had donated to civic purposes 30 years ago, which was the kind of move Dominic made when he wanted legitimacy attached to his name in a city where his name meant something specific. The donation had been covered in the society pages. There were photographs of Dominic shaking hands with a city councilman outside the front steps, both men smiling the same quality of smile. Cassian knew the building's layout. He'd had it studied before the wedding, before all of this, when the cathedral had simply been the venue Dominic Moretti had chosen for maximum visibility, and Cassian had needed to know every entry and exit the same way he needed to know them in any space where he was going to be strategically exposed. He ran the layout in his head now for different reasons. "How many men did Lucian bring in?" he said. "At the manor we counted 6. 2 are down. That leaves 4 with him plus whatever local resources he has positioned in the city." "He'll have more in the city. This wasn't improvised." Cassian's eyes were on the road, on the rain picking up now, the wipers working at speed across a windshield full of reflected streetlight. "He was waiting for me to have something worth taking." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, "You think he's had this planned?" "I think he's had a version of it planned since before the wedding." The left arm flared and he tightened his jaw and let it. "He needed to know if I'd found anything. The phone call to her was a temperature check. When she didn't fold the way she was supposed to, he moved." "Cassian." Marcus's voice had something in it that was not quite hesitation and not quite concern, but was the border between them. "He's setting the terrain. He chose the cathedral because he wants you to come through the front door angry." "I know." "So we go around, we take the time to set our own positions, we bring Reyes in, She's inside that building right now," Cassian said, and his voice was flat and final, and Marcus didn't say anything else about going around. They hit the city limits at 11:20. Rain full on now, slicking the streets, the kind of Seattle downpour that made everything look like a film set, reflected neon, empty sidewalks, the particular darkness of a city that has gone indoors. Cassian pulled off the main approach 4 blocks from the cathedral and killed the lights. "Rear entry," he said. "Service corridor on the east side, it runs below the foundation and comes up through the vestibule. Single camera, northeast corner, and I know the blind spot." He checked the weapon, checked the clip, which was not the arm that was bleeding, but the movement still pulled, and he breathed through it. "You take Harmon and go through the north transept. Wait for my signal." "Your signal or your gunshot," Marcus said. "Whichever comes first." He got out of the car. "Marquis, busy." The service corridor was cold and smelled of stone and standing water and the particular mineral damp of old buildings in wet climates. Cassian moved through it with his back to the wall and his weapon low and his blood pressure doing something functional and not good inside the tied-off arm. The earpiece gave him Marcus's progress in short syllables. In position, holding, no movement on the north approach. He came up through the vestibule access and pushed the inner door half an inch and looked through the gap. The cathedral's interior had been reduced to firelight, not ambient firelight, deliberate, positioned, controlled. Flares or storm lanterns, he couldn't tell from this angle, but they were casting the space in moving orange and throwing shadows against the stone columns that were 30 feet tall and full of the shapes of things that in the dark looked like nothing good. The pews on both sides had been pushed back against the walls and the main floor was open. Cleared, Cassian understood, as a stage. He could see 2 men positioned near the north entrance, weapons visible. One more partially behind a column on the west side. He counted the shapes and the shadows and came up with at least 5, possibly 7. And at the far end, beneath what had been the altar space where 4 weeks ago, Cassian had put a ring on Seraphina Moretti's hand and felt the topography of her scars through the lace. At the far end, in the orange-lit dark, she was on the floor. not unconscious. He could see her sitting upright, back against the altar base, hands behind her, restrained, head up. Even from this distance and in this light, he could see the quality of stillness in her posture, the practiced containment of someone managing an internal state with the only tool they had left, which was the absolute absence of visible reaction. Beside her, crouched in the posture of a man who had arranged things to his satisfaction and was now enjoying the arrangement, was Cassian Moretti. Cassian looked at him for the first time with everything he now knew. Cassian was 6 years older than Seraphina and looked younger than he was. The kind of man whose ease of manner and physical comfort in the world had the specific quality of someone who had never once paid the full cost of anything they'd done. He was wearing a white shirt that had something dark down the left sleeve, and he was speaking to Seraphina in a tone Cassian couldn't hear from the vestibule, and she was not responding, which he could tell from the fact that Cassian was still talking. Cassian pressed his earpiece. "I have eyes on. 2 north, 1 west column, at least 2 more I can't place. Target is at the altar and restrained. He's with her." Marcus low. "We're in position. Say the word." "Not yet. I need to know where the unaccounted men are before I move." He studied the shadows. The fire sources were creating specific blind spots. There, behind the east colonnade, movement that was too purposeful to be wind. And there, near the south wall, a shape that was a man trying to be a shadow and not quite managing it. 7 then, possibly 8. "Marcus, when I move, you come in hard from the north, full distraction. I don't need clean, I need loud." "Understood." He breathed once, deep and slow, and measured the distance from the vestibule door to the first column. 12 feet of open floor, lit by the nearest flare. 12 feet where he'd be fully visible to the 2 men at the north entrance if either of them happened to look south in that particular second. He moved. He made the column, made the next one, kept to the east colonnade, the specific shadow pattern he'd identified from the vestibule, and moved through the cathedral the way he'd moved through bad spaces for 15 years. Low and quiet, and with the specific attention that clears the mind of everything except geometry and threat assessment. He was 20 feet from the altar end when Cassian's voice reached him. "Thought you were smarter than this, honestly. Conversational. The tone of a man comfortable in the venue he'd chosen." "I gave you more credit." Seraphina said nothing. "He'll come through the front door," Cassian said. "He's that kind of man. I knew that about him before the wedding, before any of this. The ones who build everything themselves, the ones who make their whole identity out of control. They always come through the front door when you take something they've decided is theirs." A pause. The sound of him moving, the floor registering footsteps. "Are you his, by the way?" "I've been wondering. You moved the furniture for him, didn't you? You stopped moving the furniture." Still nothing from Seraphina. "I'm asking because it changes the math," Cassian said, and the warmth in his voice had a specific texture now that Cassian recognized from the phone call. The false intimacy of someone who has always used closeness as a delivery system for damage. If you're just an asset to him, this ends one way. If you're more than that, it ends another way. Either way it ends, but the details don't interest me, Seraphina said. Her voice was flat and present and carrying the composure like a physical object in both hands. "They should," Cassian said, "since they're about you." "They're about you," she said. "They've always been about you. Everything you've done for 15 years has been about you." A silence. "Careful," Cassian said, and the warmth was gone now. Cassian was 15 feet away, behind the last column before the altar space opened up, and he could see both of them clearly in the firelight. Seraphina on the floor with her hands behind her, Cassian standing over her with his hands in his pockets, in the posture of a man who is demonstrating that he doesn't need them. 2 guards flanking the altar approach, both armed, both watching the entrance behind Cassian. He needed the distraction before he moved into the open space. He pressed the earpiece once. The signal. 3 seconds later, the north entrance exploded with noise, Marcus and Harmon coming through hard, weapons discharging, the sound enormous in the stone space, both guards at the north end spinning toward the threat. Cassian straightened and turned, his hand already coming out of his pocket, and in that half second of turned attention, Cassian moved out of the shadow and crossed the open floor. He covered 15 feet in 2 seconds and had the weapon at Cassian Moretti's head before the man completed his turn. Cassian's voice, when it came out, was very quiet. "Tell them to stand down." Lucien looked at the weapon with the expression of a man cataloging a situation, not of a man who was frightened, which told Cassian something. "Tell them yourself," Lucien said. "They don't answer to me right now." And Cassian heard, behind him, the sound of more weapons being raised, and understood from the quality of it, the number of sources, the positions, that the 7 he'd counted had become more, that there were men who had come in behind him through the south entrance while his attention was on the altar end, and that he had walked, with full knowledge that it was a trap, directly into it. He kept the weapon at Lucian's head. "Cassian," Lucian's voice was still even, "look around." He didn't look around. He held position, held the aim, and did the count by sound. 4 behind him, at least 2 at the flanks. Marcus and Harmon were still working at the north end, and he could hear the fight, but they were pinned. "Put it down," Lucian said, "or I give the order and she's the first thing that happens." Below and between them, Seraphina was looking up at Cassian. Not with fear. With the specific clarity of someone who is precisely present in a terrible moment and has stopped flinching at terrible moments. Cassian looked at her and looked back at Lucien and made a calculation that he didn't like and knew was necessary. He lowered the weapon 2 inches. Not all the way. An acknowledgement of the math. "Good," Lucian said. "Now we can talk." "There's nothing to talk about," Cassian said. "You killed my father. I know it. And I have documentation, and it's already with federal investigators. This ends the same way regardless of what you do to me tonight." Something moved through Lucian's face then. Not surprise exactly, but a specific recalibration, the expression of a man updating a calculation. "Ah," he said. "So you did find Reinhold." Reinhold, the name of the accountant, his investigator's original source. Cassian kept his expression neutral. "I've been looking for Reinhold for 2 years, Lucien said. "I wondered what rock he'd crawled under." "It doesn't matter. The documentation doesn't disappear because you—" "The documentation goes wherever Reinhold is," Lucian said, and something in his voice had settled into a register of quiet certainty that landed badly. "My people found him 4 days ago. He's no longer in a position to testify." The silence between them had a specific quality. "You're lying," Cassian said. But he heard the thing in his own voice that he hadn't been able to fully prevent, the hairline fracture of it. "I'm really not." Lucian reached into his breast pocket, slowly, theatrically, demonstrating his lack of concern about the weapon still pointed at him, and produced a phone, turned the screen toward Cassian. A photograph. A location Cassian didn't recognize. A man he did recognize from 2 years of investigators' file photographs. Reinhold. Not standing. Cassian looked at the photograph for 2 seconds, looked away. "The federal contact," he said. "Reyes. The documentation is already with her." Reyes. Lucian tilted his head slightly. "Andrea Reyes. Transferred to the Portland field office 6 weeks ago. The case she was running was reassigned to a colleague of mine." He smiled, and it was the smile that arrived too late. "Political protection reaches further than you built for, Cassian. You knew about the congressional offices. You didn't know about the ones above them." The floor was doing the thing again, the architecture shifting under load it hadn't been designed for. Cassian stood in the middle of it and kept his face still and thought fast. "So you've got nothing," Lucian said, almost gently. "You came into my family's business and married my sister and built a very impressive case, and someone above your federal contact has been watching it develop for months and dismantling it from the top while you worked from the bottom, which is almost admirable. It's how I would have done it, actually." He glanced down at Seraphina briefly, the glance of a man noting an object's position. "Put the weapon on the floor, Cassian. We're going to have a conversation about what happens next." Akipapan. Cassian looked at Seraphina. She was looking at him, and her eyes were doing something that was not panic and not defeat, something that was active and present and thinking, and very slightly, so slightly that anyone else in the room would have missed it, and probably did. She moved her left hand, bound behind her back, but the fingers, 3 extended, close, pointing to the floor by her left hip. He looked there. He couldn't see what she was indicating. Stone floor, the base of the altar, her own shadow pooled around her. He looked back at her. She held his eyes and moved the fingers once more, and the quality of it, the control, the deliberateness, was the quality of someone who has a piece of information and is trying to transfer it in the 3 seconds available. He didn't know what she was telling him. He put the weapon on the floor. Bomb! Lucien had a chair brought in, actual chair, from the sacristy, which told Cassian how long he'd been planning the specific staging of this, and sat in it with his ankle crossed over his knee, while 2 of his men moved Cassian to the wall of the east colonnade and secured his wrist behind a stone pillar with the methodical efficiency of men who had done this type of work before. The left arm screamed when they pulled it back, and Cassian breathed through it and made no sound. Marcus and Harmon had gone silent in his earpiece, which meant they were down or captured or both. And the security team from Seattle hadn't arrived in time, and Cassian ran through the remaining variables with the systematic calm of a man who has reduced his options to almost none and needs to know exactly how many are left. Lucien stood and walked toward him, unhurried, the walk of a man on his own terrain. "You want to know something," Lucien said, stopping a few feet away, "that I've found consistently true about people who build their whole lives around a single objective?" He tilted his head. "They can't adapt when the objective is gone. All that capacity, all that intelligence and patience, and when the foundation comes out, they just—" He made a small gesture with one hand, dismissive. "Stop functioning." "Is there a point to this?" Cassian said. "The point is that you're not actually dangerous anymore. You were dangerous when you had the case, when you had the federal wire, when you had something outside this room that could hurt me. You don't have that now." He studied Cassian's face with professional interest. "Does that feel like what I think it feels like?" Cassian said nothing. "Because what I think it feels like," Lucien continued, "is the same thing it felt like the night your father died. That specific helplessness. The phone call." His voice was still even, almost analytical, the voice of someone reporting an observation. "I know about the phone call. My men said he kept talking for about 4 minutes after it stopped being worth talking. That's the thing about men who've built something. They keep trying to solve it even when it's already done." The cold that went through Cassian then was the oldest cold he knew, the one from a hospital waiting room at 23 years old. He stood with his wrists behind a stone pillar and let it move through him and did not give Lucien the reaction he was engineering for. "Where's Dominic?" Cassian said. The question shifted something in Lucien's expression, brief, controlled, but there. "My father," Lucien said, "is no longer in a position to be relevant to this situation." The specific phrasing of it. Cassian parsed it. "What did you do?" he said quietly. "I did what the situation required," Lucien said. "He was going to find out about Reinhold. He had his own people asking questions. My father had rules, you understand. His version of ethics, a criminal's ethics, but rules nonetheless." A pause. "I stopped being willing to manage those rules about 6 months ago." Cassian stared at him. "Your father-in-law," Lucien said, and the slight emphasis on father-in-law carried something theatrical, "had a cardiac event 11 days ago. He's in a memory care facility in Bellevue, private. He won't be remembering much of anything going forward, which is a kindness given what he'd have to reckon with." He smiled the late smile. "I'm the Moretti family now, Cassian. Have been since the wedding, functionally. You married into an organization that I control." Cassian was looking at him with a very specific quality of attention now. Not the anger he'd been managing since the phone call, not the cold grief that Lucien had been trying to weaponize, but something more deliberate and structural. He was listening to Lucien's voice, to what was in it, and he was cataloging something specific. Lucien liked this. The staging, the monologue, the audience of one restrained against a pillar. He needed this to be witnessed, which meant he needed Cassian alive long enough to witness it, which gave Cassian a window, narrow, possibly sufficient. He pressed the earpiece with his shoulder, a movement invisible behind the pillar. The specific double press code that meant hold position, do not engage, wait. If Marcus was still receiving, if Harmon was mobile, if any of the variables he'd built for were still operable. "What about her?" Cassian said, because keeping Lucien talking was the only structural advantage he had in the next 60 seconds. Lucien glanced toward the altar end where Seraphina remained on the floor, still restrained, still watching. The glance had the specific quality of a man viewing a loose end rather than a person. Seraphina is a liability that has been a liability for 15 years, Lucien said. What she witnessed, what she knows, what she's apparently decided to share with her new husband, all of that ends tonight. I would have preferred to handle this differently. I spent years managing it differently, but she stopped being manageable when she stopped being afraid. And you need her to be afraid, Cassian said. I need her to be finished, Lucien said. Those aren't the same thing, though one usually precedes the other. From the altar end, Seraphina's voice, flat and carrying. You've been afraid of me for 3 years, since Petrov. That's what this is. Lucien turned to look at her. The temperature of his expression dropped. You had one witness who knew your roots and your contacts and what you did with people who wanted out, she said. And then you killed him in front of me, which gave you a second witness. Everything since then has been about containing that. All of it. She looked at him without flinching. You're not here because you're powerful. You're here because you're scared. Lucien walked toward her, and the walk was no longer the walk of a man on his own terrain. It was the walk of someone whose temperature had changed. Don't, Cassian said sharply. Lucien ignored him. He crouched down in front of Seraphina with the specific proximity of someone who has learned to make proximity itself a weapon. And he said, very quietly, something that Cassian couldn't hear from across the room. And he watched Seraphina's face receive it, and he watched her hold, she held. And then Lucien said it again, and this time the hold fractured, something moving through her face that was not fear, but was adjacent to it in the way that grief is adjacent to rage, something that came from a deeper place than the composure, something that was old and had been surviving on very little for a very long time. Lucien stood and turned back to Cassian. Here's what happens, he said. You're going to tell me where the documentation went. All of it. The financial records, the Petrov material, everything your investigator found. You're going to give me names, contact information, server locations, whatever you transferred to Reyes before her reassignment. All of it. And in exchange, Cassian said. In exchange, I make this quick, Lucien said. For both of you. Cassian looked at him. You have nothing left, Lucien said. Your case is gone. Your witness is gone. Your federal contact is gone. Your security team, he glanced toward the north entrance where Marcus and Harmon had gone quiet, is occupied. You're bleeding through your shirt, and I have your wife. The word wife with a specific inflection. Give me the locations, and this ends fast. Don't, and I'll take my time with her first and make you listen to it the same way you listened to your father die on the phone. He held Cassian's eyes. I know which one of those you can live with and which one you can't. The stone behind Cassian's back was cold through his shirt. His arm was sending detailed reports of itself that he was not reading. He looked at Lucien's face, and he thought about 11 years and a case that was apparently ash, and a man named Reinhold who had lived in hiding for 2 years and hadn't been hidden enough, and a federal contact who'd been moved off the board before Cassian even knew it was a board. He thought about the fingers against the floor, 3 extended, pointing toward the base of the altar, Seraphina's quiet signal in the moment he'd lowered the weapon. Something there, something she knew about, and he didn't. He thought about a 15-year-old girl who had found a ledger and made the mistake of trusting the wrong person with it, and who had spent the subsequent 11 years surviving on composure and barricaded doors and the specific daily act of refusing to be finished, and who had said to him across a kitchen table at 6 in the morning, I've been waiting for a reason. You're the reason. Lucien was waiting. I'm going to need a minute, Cassian said. His voice was even. To think. You have 30 seconds. Then I'll need 30 seconds. Lucien smiled, turned away to speak with one of his men, the brief dismissal of a man who believes the outcome is settled. Cassian moved his wrists against the restraint and felt the give in it. They'd used zip ties, which was efficient and which had a specific structural weakness at the locking head, and his left arm was compromised but his right wasn't. And he'd been working the angle since they'd secured him, and he thought he had maybe 2 more minutes of manipulation before he could. His earpiece crackled. One sound, very low. The specific pattern, 3 short. Marcus. Still receiving. Still mobile somewhere in the dark of the cathedral's north end. Cassian closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he looked across the cathedral at Seraphina, still on the floor against the altar base, and she was looking back at him. And when their eyes met, she moved her gaze deliberately, pointedly, unmistakably, to the floor beside her left hip again. And this time, in the shifting firelight, he saw it. A shape against the stone that was too regular to be shadow. Small, rectangular. Something that had been there before they arrived, before the altar base, left there or hidden there by someone who had known this space and known this night was coming. His mind went very fast and very cold and very clear. She had known. Not about tonight specifically, but about the cathedral, about Lucien's patterns, about the place he'd returned to when he wanted to stage something significant. She'd been in that estate for 26 years, and she'd been paying attention for all of them in the way that people who can't afford to stop paying attention do. And she had put something there. Or she knew what was there. Or she was telling him something about the altar base that he needed to know in the next 30 seconds before Lucian turned back around. Cassian looked at the restraints on his wrists. He looked at the distance between himself and the altar end. He looked at Lucian's back, still turned, still speaking to the man beside him. And he began, very quietly, and with the focused patience of a man who has spent 15 years learning to wait for the precise moment, to work the angle of the zip tie's locking head against the rough edge of the stone pillar at his back. And he breathed slowly and evenly, and thought about what the shape on the floor beside Seraphina might be, and what it meant that she'd signaled it twice. And he thought about the 30 seconds Lucian had given him, which were almost up. And he thought that the next 30 seconds were the zip tie gave on the 41st second. Not cleanly, the locking head sheared against the stone edge, and the plastic bit into his right wrist before it released, and the rush of circulation into his hands was immediate and burning, and he swallowed the sound it wanted to produce. His left arm was worse. The bandage Marcus had tied had soaked through entirely, and the muscle was sending specific and detailed complaints that he categorized and set aside, because there was no version of the next 4 minutes in which the arm was the priority. Lucian was still turned away. Still talking to the man beside him, a low exchange that had the quality of logistics, of a man closing out administrative details before moving to the next item on a list. Cassian had approximately 6 seconds before Lucian turned back around. He moved. Not toward Lucian, toward the altar end. He went low and fast along the east colonnade, using the shadow cast by the nearest fire source, and the 2 guards flanking the altar approach were both watching the north end, where Marcus had last made noise, and neither of them corrected their attention in time. He was 15 feet from Seraphina when the first one clocked the movement and opened his mouth, and Cassian covered the remaining distance before the sound came out, hit the man hard with his right shoulder and drove him back into the stone column, and the guard's head connected with the pillar, and the sound it made was conclusive. The second guard was faster. He got the weapon up. Cassian was already below the line of it. He came in under the raised arm and drove an elbow into the man's throat. Not full force, controlled, enough to close the airway for the 10 seconds he needed, and took the weapon as the man folded. Behind him, Lucien's voice. "Stop!" Cassian was already at Seraphina's side, weapon up and covering the approach, his back to the altar base. She was looking at him with the specific focused calm of someone who has just watched a situation change and is updating in real time. "The floor," he said, low and fast. "Left side." "What is it?" She shifted, and he saw, pressed into a gap in the stone where 2 altar blocks met at the base, something dark and small and rectangular, and she said, "Pull it out, it's taped." He kept the weapon on Lucian's position. Lucian had stopped moving, 10 yards away, 3 of his men now repositioning in his peripheral vision, and reached with his left hand to the base of the altar, found the gap she'd indicated, felt the taped edge of something, and pulled. A drive. Small. USB, old style, the kind that predated the cloud migration most organizations had made, which meant it had been put there before the migration, which meant it was old, which meant someone had been planning for this specific contingency for longer than the current crisis. He looked at her. "Petrov," she said, "before Lucian took him. He gave it to me. I didn't know where else." Her voice was low and rapid, and completely without decoration. "It has everything. His own records, not my father's. Lucien's private routes, the political contacts, the account numbers. Petrov kept his own insurance." She held Cassian's eyes. "I've had it for 3 years. I didn't know who to give it to." 3 years. She'd been carrying this for 3 years behind barricaded doors and composure built from necessity, waiting for someone she could trust with it. And she had put it here, in the place she'd known Lucien would eventually bring this to a close, because she'd understood his patterns and his need for staging better than anyone alive. Cassian closed his fist around the drive, Lucien's voice across the space. Whatever she just gave you, it doesn't change tonight. It changes everything after tonight, Cassian said. And you know it. A pause. In the firelight, Lucien's face was doing the recalibration thing again. The rapid internal update of a man whose calculations have just been revised by an input he didn't account for. He was looking at the drive in Cassian's hand, and he was looking at Seraphina, and the expression that moved through him then was not fear exactly, but was the face of a man who has just understood the shape of how badly he miscalculated. He'd spent 3 years looking for Petrov's insurance. He'd torn apart the man's known locations, his contacts, his digital footprint. He'd never found it because it had been in the hands of a woman he'd underestimated for 15 years, waiting in a building he owned, in a floor he'd stood on 100 times. Kill them, Lucien said. Everything happened at once. Bog. The north entrance detonated back into noise as Marcus came through. Not captured, not down, positioned and waiting, and the double press code had done its work. And he came through the north transept with Harmon and 2 men Cassian didn't recognize, but whose efficiency he immediately appreciated. Lucien's men at the north end swung toward the new contact. Cassian pulled Seraphina up from the floor. Her hand still bound, he got the weapon into his left hand and ignored the arm's response to this, and used his right to work the binding. No tool, just the physical brute problem of it, and moved them both behind the altar base as the first rounds came in. The cathedral became noise. Stone columns absorbed rounds with the indifferent authority of things that have been standing for a century and planned to continue. The fire sources, 3 of them, positioned by Lucien's men for the staging, cast the space in moving orange that turned the shadows into mobile things and made target acquisition a specific kind of difficult. Cassian worked Seraphina's wrists, felt the binding give 1 degree, 2, the plastic cutting into his fingers, and he didn't care, and she was absolutely still in his grip, not fighting the restraint or him, conserving everything for what came next. The binding broke. She rolled her wrists once, fast, and the expression that crossed her face in that single second was not relief. It was something more specific, the look of a person who has just recovered a capability that was taken from them and who has immediate plans for it. "Stay behind the altar," he said. "I know this building better than you do," she said. He looked at her. "East Sacristy," she said. "There's a secondary exit through the sacristy that comes out on the north side of the block. Lucien doesn't know about it. It was sealed off in my grandfather's time, and my father had it reopened for private use. Lucien wasn't involved in that renovation." Her voice was completely level, briefing him like a tactician, which is what she was. "If we can get to the east corridor, we can get Marcus's team around behind his men's position." Cassian processed this in approximately 1 second. "Can you get there without me?" "Yes." "Then go. Get to Marcus on the north approach and tell him east sacristy, flank left. Go." She held his gaze for 1 beat. Not hesitation, something else. Something that passed between them in that beat that neither of them had language for and didn't need. And then she moved, low and fast along the base of the east colonnade, using the shadow exactly the way he would have used it, and he watched her go and then turned back to the open floor and the problem of Lucien Moretti. Lucien had pulled back toward the south end of the cathedral during the engagement at the north entrance, which was tactically sound and told Cassian he wasn't solely a man who relied on other people to manage his physical situations. He moved well. He was thinking. 2 of his men were down. The north engagement was loud and still active. 3 of Lucien's remaining people were positioned between Cassian and Lucien's current location, using the pews pushed against the walls as partial cover, which was better than nothing and worse than stone. Cassian had the guard's weapon. 9 rounds left. He'd done the count. And his left arm, which was functional in the way that things are functional when they are operating significantly outside their preferred parameters. He breathed through it, checked the sight line, moved to the next column. A round hit the stone 6 inches from his shoulder, and he felt the fragment of it catch his cheekbone, a graze, sharp and immediate, and the warmth of it ran down his face, and he blinked it away and kept moving. The first man between him and Lucien, he came around the south side of a pew cluster and the man didn't have time to reorient his aim, and Cassian took him down close, physical, the weapon used as an impact tool because, in the confined space between the pews, the discharge would have been worse than the alternative, and it cost him. The man was larger and got a hand into Cassian's wounded arm before going down, and the white burst of it filled his vision for one full second in which he was completely blind and running on proprioception and 15 years of doing this. When his vision cleared, he was on his knees on the cathedral floor, and the man was not moving, and his arm was broadcasting something that was past complaint and into a new register entirely. He got up. He stayed up through the specific act of will that has no name, but that people who have been in bad situations know intimately. The will that is not courage, not adrenaline, not any of the things it gets called in other people's stories, but is simply the refusal to be on the floor when there is still something that needs doing. He moved. The second man saw him coming and made the mistake of hesitating. A half second of something that might have been the recognition of what was in Cassian's face, and that half second was enough. Down. The third positioned man broke, ran for the south exit, the weapon abandoned, and Cassian let him go because chasing him would take him further from Lucian and further from the drive in his pocket and the 4 minutes of this situation that were still unresolved. Lucian was at the south end of the main nave near the exit, and he'd watched his last position man run, and when Cassian emerged from the pew clusters with blood on his face and the arm that was wrong and the weapon that had been someone else's, Lucian looked at him with the expression of a man doing a final assessment. "You should be dead," Lucian said. It wasn't an insult. It sounded almost like an observation. "Common misconception," Cassian said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. The cheekbone was bleeding into the corner of his mouth, and he tasted copper. Lucien looked at the weapon. "You're not going to shoot me in a cathedral with a federal case that's already been dismantled. You shoot me, and you're the Moretti son-in-law who murdered a prominent family member, and whatever you are building becomes a very different story." "The case isn't dismantled," Cassian said. "Reinhold is dead. Reyes has been moved. The material I sent her, some of it." He held Lucien's eyes. "Not all of it. And what your sister just gave me goes to 3 separate contacts simultaneously, none of whom are accessible to your political network the moment I'm outside this building. That's already queued." It wasn't queued. The drive was in his pocket, and the queue was a promise he was making in real time. "Shoot me and the queue goes anyway. Don't shoot me, we walk out of here, and the next 6 months are very unpleasant for you, but you're breathing through them." Lucian looked at him. "Or," Cassian said, "you can make this the kind of ending that leaves no variables." It was an invitation, and they both knew it. Lucien reached behind him and came out with a weapon of his own, compact, the kind carried in a back holster, personal, and not delegated. And the late smile was back, and Cassian read it and understood that Lucian had decided to be the kind of man who resolves his own variables personally, which was the decision of a man whose ego had, at the critical moment, outweighed his calculation. "Drop it," Cassian said. "You first," Lucien said. Neither of them dropped anything. From the east side of the cathedral came a sound, the specific sound of a door that has been sealed for decades and has just been opened by someone who knew where it was, and then footsteps, and then Marcus came through the east sacristy arch with 2 men and Harmon behind him, flanking left exactly as Cassian had relayed, and the geometry of the room changed completely. Lucien looked at the new positions. Did the math. The math was not favorable. He made his decision in the interval of one breath. He turned the weapon away from Cassian, toward the east sacristy arch, toward Seraphina, who had come through it with Marcus, and was standing now in the entrance with her empty hands visible and her eyes on the room, reading the room, and Lucian moved the weapon to her line of sight with the specific deliberateness of a man who has identified his last lever and intends to use it. "Everyone stops," Lucian said. His voice was still even, the professional voice, the charm stripped off, and the functional core of him visible underneath. "Everyone stops right now." Everything stopped. Cassian had the weapon trained on Lucien. Marcus had his weapon trained on Lucien. Lucien had his weapon trained on Seraphina, who was 12 feet away in the sacristy arch with nothing between her and the line of fire. The fire sources were burning lower now, one of them guttered to a red pulse, and the cathedral had the quality of a space that has used up something and is waiting for what comes next. Seraphina was looking at her brother across the 12 feet, and the weapon and 15 years of everything that had passed between them, and her face was not the composure face. It was something under the composure, the actual face, and what was in it was not fear of the weapon or of him. It was something older and more exhausted than fear, the look of someone who has been waiting for this specific moment and has stopped being willing to defer it. "Lucien," she said. "Don't," he said. "You've been afraid of what I know since I was 16 years old," she said. "Every year since then you've made me smaller so there'd be less of me to be afraid of. And here we are, and I'm still here, and you're still afraid." Her voice was steady, not performed. "You can end it tonight, or you can not end it tonight, and either way I'm still the person who watched you take Petrov out of that room, and I'm still going to say so. To anyone who will listen. For as long as it takes." She held his eyes. "You don't get to make me small enough for that to stop being true." In the firelight, something moved through Lucien's face that was not the recalibration, not the late smile, not the professional assessment. Something raw and brief and almost human. The face underneath the man he'd constructed. And for 1 second, Cassian could see what he might have been before whatever had been done to him or chosen by him had built everything over it. Then it closed, and his finger moved on the trigger. Cassian fired. Not at Lucien's center mass. At his weapon hand. A shot that required the kind of precision that is not guaranteed under current conditions. Wounded arm, moving fire sources, elevated heart rate, and that Cassian made anyway because the alternative was the alternative, and he was not willing to exist in a world where the alternative had happened. The round hit Lucien's forearm. The weapon dropped. Lucien went back a step, hit the south wall, slid down it, and sat there with his arm against his chest, and his face doing something that was pain, and something that was the specific expression of a man who has just understood that the situation is over, and that he is the last thing standing in it. Cassian was across the room in 4 strides. He stood over Lucien with the weapon at close range, and Lucien looked up at him, and the late smile made one final attempt and didn't complete itself. "Don't," Cassian said. Just the word. Nothing attached to it. Lucien looked at the weapon, looked at Cassian's face, looked at whatever was in that face and read it accurately. He stayed on the floor. Marcus was already moving. Cuffs. The second weapon secured. The professional management of a situation that had reached its conclusion and now required administration. Harmon was on his radio calling for the Seattle contacts, for medical, for the sequence of things that happened when a contained situation needed to become a documented one. Cassian lowered the weapon. His arm was not going to continue to be ignored, and it made this known with some authority. He breathed through it, standing over the man who had killed his father and done to his sister what he had done. And he felt the cold rage that had lived in him for 11 years, and he waited to feel it resolve, the way he'd imagined it resolving, the satisfaction of the account settled. He felt something, but it wasn't that. He turned away from Lucien before he could examine it too closely. Seraphina was still in the sacristy arch. She had not moved during the exchange, had stood exactly there, hands visible, eyes on the room. And when Cassian walked toward her, she watched him come with the expression that wasn't composure and wasn't the stripped-down face from the confrontation with her brother. It was something else, something that was present and quiet and had the quality of a room after a long storm when the pressure finally equalizes. He stopped in front of her. He was bleeding from the cheekbone and the arm, and probably somewhere else he hadn't located yet. She was unmarked except for the lines the restraint had left on her wrists. Both of them were breathing hard in the way of people who have been operating on the reserve side of their capacity. He didn't say anything. There wasn't a version of what needed to be said that fit inside words right now. She looked at him. Her eyes were steady and very clear, and something in them was so directly present, so unguarded in a way that he understood had cost her more than anything else in this building tonight, that he felt it land in his chest with the weight of something that had been falling toward him for weeks and had finally arrived. She reached up and pressed 2 fingers to his face, the bleeding cheekbone, with a precision that was both clinical and entirely not clinical, and the touch was so careful and so deliberate and so different from everything that had characterized the previous 11 years of his life that he stood very still under it and made no sound. "You're going to need a hospital," she said. "I know," he said. "Marcus can—" "In a minute," he said. She kept her fingers against his face for a moment longer. Then she took her hand back, and they stood in the diminishing firelight of the cathedral, with Marcus administering the situation behind them, and Cassian thought about the drive in his pocket, and the 3 contacts he'd told Lucian it was already queued for, and the work that was going to begin in about 6 hours when the Seattle field office opened and the documentation arrived, and the months of legal architecture that were going to need to be rebuilt from the pieces that were still operable. He thought about all of that. He thought about it the way you think about the next task when the current task has just been resolved but hasn't fully settled yet, in the way that things don't fully settle until you've had sleep and distance and the ability to let your nervous system understand that the immediate threat is handled. He thought about his father. He thought about the weight of that, which was the same weight it had always been and would probably always be, except that tonight it sat differently in him. Not lighter, but differently shaped. The way grief reshapes when the thing it was organized around has finally moved. He looked at the drive in his palm. Petrov's records. 3 years of Seraphina carrying this alone behind locked doors and composure built from necessity, waiting for someone she could trust with it. He closed his fingers around it. Behind him, Lucien was being handled. The cathedral was cooling. Somewhere outside, the rain was still doing what it had been doing when this night began. Indifferent and continuous, the same rain that would be falling tomorrow over the beginning of a very different kind of work. Cassian put the drive in his inside pocket against his chest. He looked at Seraphina. "Let's go," he said. She nodded. They moved toward the north entrance where Marcus had the exit secured, and Cassian felt the arm and the cheekbone and the various other points of damage that the next few hours were going to require attention to, and he felt the drive against his sternum, and he felt, under all of it, beneath the operational and the physical and the immediate, the specific and unfamiliar and completely unplanned sensation of a man who came looking for the end of a story and found, instead, the beginning of a completely different one, standing beside him and walking through a door into the rain outside the cathedral had not stopped. It came down the way it had been coming down all night, without urgency, without drama, the steady and different percussion of a Pacific Northwest October that didn't care what had happened inside the building, it was falling on. Cassian and Seraphina came through the north entrance into it, and neither of them flinched from the cold or the wet, because both of them had spent the last several hours in conditions that had recalibrated what flinching was for. Marcus had 2 vehicles outside. He'd also, with the operational foresight that made him worth every dollar Cassian had paid him over 6 years, called for a private medical contact, a former trauma surgeon who now worked for people who needed the kind of medical attention that didn't produce paperwork. The man was waiting in the second vehicle with a bag and the specific unhurried composure of someone who had seen worse and was prepared to see more. Cassian sat in the back of the first vehicle while the surgeon worked on the arm, and he watched the cathedral through the rain-streaked window, and he thought about the drive in his inside pocket pressing against his sternum, and he thought about the work that needed to begin in approximately 5 hours. Beside him, Seraphina sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the same window and didn't speak, and the silence between them was not the silence of the first week at Blackthorn Manor, which had been 2 people maintaining defended perimeters. It was the silence of 2 people who have been through something together and are still in the immediate aftermath of it, where words are not yet the right instrument. The surgeon said, "I'm going to need you to hold still," and Cassian held still. And the arm was cleaned and properly dressed, and the cheekbone was examined and determined not to require stitching, but would require explaining to anyone who saw it for the next 2 weeks. And the surgeon gave him a list of things that would happen if he didn't rest the arm that Cassian listened to with the respectful attention of a man who had no intention of complying but appreciated the professional delivery. When the surgeon moved to the second vehicle, Cassian looked at his arm in the clean dressing and then looked at the window and said, "There are 3 contacts I need to reach before 6 a.m. "I know," Seraphina said. "The drive. I know what's on the drive." She turned from the window. Her face in the reflected streetlight was tired in a way that was clean rather than defeated. The tiredness of someone who has put down something heavy, not of someone who has been put down themselves. "I memorized most of it over the years, in case I lost it." A pause. "I can reconstruct the key account sequences from memory if anything on the drive is corrupted." He looked at her. Petrov was thorough, she said. He understood that physical media could be lost or damaged. He made sure I understood what I was holding. She met his eyes. "I've been holding it for 3 years, Cassian. I know it." He thought about what that meant. 3 years of carrying that knowledge alone, the specific weight of being the only living repository of information that a dangerous man wanted buried, barricading her door every night not only from old habit, but from the very specific and rational awareness of what she knew and what it made her. He thought about all of that, and he understood, in a way he hadn't fully assembled before this moment, the full dimensions of what she had survived. "All right," he said, "then we do this together." She nodded. Not like she was receiving a concession, like she'd been expecting to do it together and was confirming the arrangement. Marcus appeared at this window, bent to speak through the glass. "Seattle field office opens at 7. Reyes's replacement is a man named Carver. I've pulled his background. He's clean, career agent, no political exposure. He's been sitting on the stalled Moretti case for 6 weeks and hasn't touched it, which means either he's been told to leave it or he's waiting for something to move." "Send him something to move," Cassian said. "Not through official channels. Personal. Something that tells him the case has new material and a witness, and to be at his office at 7 sharp." "Already drafting it," Marcus said, "and the 3 contacts I flagged. 2 are reachable tonight. The 3rd is in a different time zone. I'll have him by 4 a.m. Marcus straightened. "There's also the matter of the cathedral." He paused professionally. "Lucien's men, the ones who didn't walk out. Call Reyes's replacement for that too," Cassian said. "Give him everything. Don't manage it. Let the federal process own it." Marcus looked at him for a moment, the look of a man who had worked for Cassian for 6 years and had occasionally been asked to manage things in ways that kept the federal process at a useful distance, and who was now registering a change in approach. "Understood," Marcus said, and went. They drove north through the rain, back toward Blackthorn Manor, and Cassian slept for approximately 40 minutes in the back of the vehicle, which was not enough and was what was available. And when he woke, Seraphina was awake and looking at the dark highway ahead, and the drive was still in his pocket, and the arm was a constant low-level presence that he'd adjusted to the way you adjust to a sound that isn't stopping. "Your father," he said when they were an hour out. "Dominic." Lucien said a memory care facility in Bellevue. She was quiet for a moment. "I know the one," she said. "There are 2 in Bellevue that my father had connections to. The larger one. He donated to their operating fund 6 years ago." She paused. "He would have chosen it. For the discretion." "I'll find out if what Lucien described is accurate," Cassian said. "Whether it was actually a cardiac event or whether Lucien accelerated it," she said, finishing the thought without visible distress, which was not the absence of feeling but the presence of a woman who had been reckoning with what her brother was capable of for 15 years and had done the math on this possibility long ago. "I'd like to know, whatever the answer is." "I'll find out." She turned from the window and looked at him directly. "Whatever he did, whatever he chose to look away from, he was still my father. I'm not going to pretend that resolves anything, but it's true." "I know," Cassian said. And then, because it needed to be said and he'd been carrying it since the day he'd opened his investigator's revised file. "He didn't order my father's death. I spent 11 years believing he did. He didn't." She absorbed this. "He chose the wrong son to believe," she said, "over and over for 15 years. That's its own category of damage." A pause. "But he didn't pull the trigger." "No," Cassian said. "He didn't." They rode in silence for a while after that, both of them holding the complicated weight of families that had done real harm and real damage, and were still, by the stubborn biology of the thing, families and the specific human problem of what you do with that. The work began at 4:45 a.m. at the desk in Cassian's study at Blackthorn Manor. He connected the drive and ran the content inventory while Seraphina sat in the chair across from him with coffee, actual hot coffee this time, not the cold tea of those first careful mornings, and walked him through the architecture of Petrov's records, the account sequences she'd committed to memory, the organizational structure of what Lucien had built in the spaces between what Dominic's operation had been doing. It was substantial, more substantial in different ways than what Cassian's own investigator had assembled. Petrov had been inside the operation in a way that an external investigation couldn't replicate, and he'd been thorough with the kind of thoroughness that comes from a man who understood exactly how much danger his knowledge put him in and had decided to make himself as difficult to erase as possible. He'd failed at that, in the end, but the records had survived. They worked through the material for 2 hours, organizing it, building the transmission package for Carver at the Seattle field office, structuring the subsidiary packages for the 2 other contacts Marcus had reached. Seraphina worked with a precision and a retention that Cassian watched with the specific regard of someone who has seen a capability that has been contained and unused for a long time finally being deployed at full capacity, and it was, in its way, something to witness. At 6:50 a.m., he transmitted the primary package to Carver. At 7:12 a.m., Carver's office called back. The voice on the other end was careful and professional and had the particular quality of controlled urgency. A man who has just received something that changes the shape of his next 6 months and is deciding, in real time, whether to be skeptical or to be moving. Cassian told him about Seraphina, that she was a direct witness to the Petrov incident, that she was prepared to provide formal testimony, that she was currently under his protection and would remain so through the legal process. A pause on the line. "Mr. Vale," Carver said, "I need to be direct with you about the nature of your own potential exposure in this." "I know what my exposure is," Cassian said. "I have attorneys who know it better than I do. What I'm offering you is the case that's been stalled on your desk for 6 weeks, fully documented, with a cooperating witness and physical evidence. What you do with that is your business." He paused. "I'd suggest you do it quickly. The subject is in federal custody in Seattle as of approximately 3 hours ago." Another pause. Longer. "I'll be at the office in 20 minutes, Carver said. "Don't transmit anything else until I've reviewed what you've sent." "Already transmitted?" Cassian said. "Review it at your pace. We're not going anywhere." He ended the call. Across the desk, Seraphina was looking at him with the expression that wasn't composure and wasn't the raw face from the cathedral. The third expression, the one that had been emerging over the past weeks, the one that belonged to a person who was in the process of becoming something slightly different from what circumstances had made her. "That's the beginning," she said. "That's the beginning," he agreed. "The next 6 months are going to be—" "I know what the next 6 months are going to be." She set down her coffee. "I've known what testifying would mean since I was 16 years old, and I decided not to. I know what it costs." She met his eyes. "I've been saving up for it." Well, the federal investigation formally reopened on a Tuesday, 11 days after the cathedral. Carver moved with the speed of a man who had been waiting for material and had finally received it, and the political protection that Lucien had maintained above the congressional level began to fracture within the first week, when 2 of the 3 relevant contacts, faced with the scope of what Petrov's records documented, made the calculation that proximity to Cassian Moretti was no longer a manageable liability. Political protection is a transactional arrangement, and transactions end when the cost exceeds the benefit. The benefit of protecting Cassian Moretti had decreased substantially when he was in federal custody with a cooperating witness and documentation that covered 9 years of operations across 4 states. Cassian spent most of that month on calls with his attorneys, going through the legal architecture of his own position with the kind of systematic attention he gave to any structural problem. His exposure was real, and he didn't minimize it. There were transactions in his history that required explanation, and some that required more than explanation, and the process of producing that documentation and those explanations was not comfortable and was necessary, and he did it because the alternative, well, managing it the old way, the way he'd been operating for 15 years, was no longer the version of himself he intended to be. It was a strange thing to notice, in the middle of everything, the version of himself he intended to be. He hadn't thought in those terms before. He'd thought in terms of objectives and outcomes and the building of things towards specific ends. The question of who he was in the process of those objectives hadn't been a question he'd allocated time to. He allocated time to it now. Seraphina gave her formal testimony on a Wednesday in November, in a conference room in the Seattle Federal Building with Cassian's attorney on one side of her and Carver across the table and a digital recorder between them. Cassian wasn't in the room. She hadn't asked him to be, and he hadn't offered, understanding that this was a thing she needed to do in her own dimensions, without the texture of his presence in it. He waited in the corridor outside for 4 hours and 20 minutes. When she came out, she looked the way people look when they have put something down that they've been carrying so long they'd forgotten it was separate from them. Slightly lighter and slightly disoriented by the lightness, the body still compensating for a weight that was no longer there. She looked at him in the corridor and she didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything, and they walked to the elevator together in the specific silence of two people who have passed through something and are now on the other side of it. In the elevator going down, she said, "It took less time than I expected." "Testimony usually does," he said. "The anticipation runs long." "Is that from experience?" "Enough of it." He looked at the elevator doors. "You did well." She made a sound that was almost a laugh, brief and dry. "You weren't in the room." "No, but you came out walking, which is the relevant data point." This time the sound was an actual laugh, short and real, and it changed the quality of the air in the elevator in a way that was small and significant. And he found himself looking at her sideways and then looking back at the doors, because some things needed to be approached obliquely. Dominic Moretti was at the Bellevue facility Seraphina had identified. The event had been what Lucian described: cardiac, documented, the attending physician's records consistent with natural causes. And Cassian's medical contacts confirmed that the presentation was consistent with the stress of the preceding months and with Dominic's pre-existing conditions rather than with intervention. Seraphina visited him twice in November and once in December. Cassian drove her and waited in the parking structure and didn't ask what happened inside, and she didn't offer it. And he understood that what happened in those rooms was between a daughter and a man who had failed her in ways that were specific and costly, and who was no longer capable of understanding that she was there, and that neither of those things erased the other, and that she was going because she had decided to, which was the only reason that mattered. After the third visit, she got in the car and sat for a moment looking at her hands on her knees and then said, "He thought I was my mother today." Cassian said nothing. "He talked to me for 20 minutes thinking I was her." She paused. He was kind to her, in his memory. He was kind. She turned to look out the window at the parking structure's concrete wall. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," Cassian said. "I know." A long pause. "I just wanted to say it out loud." "All right," he said. He started the car and they drove, and she said nothing else about it, and he didn't push, and the silence on the drive back was the kind that holds things rather than concealing them. The Moretti Syndicate's formal legal dissolution came through in February, the result of the federal case combined with the civil proceedings that had been filed by parties in 3 states. The assets were seized, the organizational structure documented and formally closed, the name stripped of its operational capacity. What had taken 3 generations to build was unmade in the span of 6 months, not by violence, but by the patient architecture of documentation and testimony and the institutional process that violence had been outrunning for decades. Lucian entered a plea arrangement in March. The terms were not lenient. Cassian received a notification from Carver's office about the arrangement and read it once and filed it, and did not feel the thing he'd anticipated feeling, which had been something close to relief or completion. What he felt was closer to neutral, the specific neutrality of a debt that has been settled and is no longer a presence in your daily accounting. It was there, and then it wasn't. Or rather it was, but differently. Still there, just no longer the load-bearing wall of everything. He thought about his father for a long time that evening, sitting in the study at Blackthorn Manor with the ocean outside doing its continuous work against the cliffs. He thought about who his father had been. Not the symbol, not the loss, not the organizing principle of 11 years of patient rage, but the actual man. The man who had called him from the road to say he was heading into a meeting that would maybe, finally, end the thing that had been between the Vale and Moretti organizations for 30 years. Who had sounded tired but steady. Who had said, almost as an afterthought before ending the call, "I'll see you for dinner Sunday. Don't bring wine. I have wine." He had been thinking about what to bring for dinner when the next call came in. Cassian sat with that for a while. The specific ordinary human weight of it, the way real losses always have that, the small domestic thing adjacent to the catastrophe, the sentence about dinner that ended up being the last full sentence, and how that's the part that doesn't resolve ever, because there's nothing to resolve it with. You just carry it differently over time. He thought he was starting to carry it differently. They left Seattle in April. It wasn't a dramatic departure. There was no moment of decision that could be precisely located. It was more like the gradual accumulation of small choices pointing in the same direction. The conversations about what came next. The practical questions about the manor and Cassian's business interests, and what Seraphina wanted her life to look like now that the shape of it was no longer determined by other people's requirements. The answer to that last question had emerged slowly and had the quality of something that had always been there, waiting under the noise, and now the noise was gone. She wanted something quiet, something near water, but not the Pacific. The Pacific at Blackthorn had been beautiful and had also been the sound of captivity for a while, and she had good associations with it now, but also the other ones. And she thought she'd prefer a different coast for a while, something smaller, a town rather than a city. Cassian found the place the way he found most things, systematically, with criteria, eliminating options until what remained was the right answer. A coastal town in Maine that had a working harbor and a good independent bookstore and a population small enough that two people could exist in it without being a public fact. A house on the harbor's edge that needed work. The bones were good, and the framing was original, and the previous owners had lived in it for 40 years and left it with the specific character of a place that has been inhabited by people who stayed. He bought it and spent 2 weeks on it before they arrived, working with a local contractor on the kitchen and the west-facing windows that needed replacing, doing some of the structural work himself because he'd told her he liked knowing how things were put together, and that had been true and was still true, and the physical work of it was also something else, something that was about putting his hands on something that was going to last and making it right. They arrived on a Saturday in April when the Maine coast was cold and clear in the specific way of early spring, bright, sharp-edged, the air with the mineral quality of a season that has just turned over. The harbor was visible from the front of the house. Small boats on gray-green water, the sound of the working waterfront drifting across on the wind. Seraphina stood in the front doorway with her bag and looked at the harbor and looked at the house and didn't say anything for a moment. "The studio is the back room on the second floor," Cassian said. "North-facing light. I was told that's the correct direction." She turned to look at him. "Who told you that?" "I researched it," he said. Apparently it's consistent light. Doesn't change through the day." She looked at him with the expression he'd come to know. The one that wasn't composure, wasn't the careful armor, was the actual face, and which he had come to understand contained more warmth than she'd ever had consistent occasion to use, and was now, by degrees, finding occasion. "You research studio lighting," she said. "I research things," he said. She shook her head, not quite a laugh, not quite not, and went inside. The first weeks were the quiet kind. They learned each other in the domestic way. The details of how two people with very different histories and very different damage occupy the same space and build the routines that are, without either party announcing it, the infrastructure of a life. He was up early and she was not. She cooked better than he did, and neither of them felt the need to make a ceremony of this fact. He worked at the desk by the harbor-facing window in the morning. She was in the studio by mid-afternoon and sometimes didn't come down until the light went. He noticed she had stopped barricading the door. He noticed it the way you notice the absence of a sound you had been calibrated to hear, an absence that had its own specific quality, its own small significance. The door at night was simply a door. She slept through the nights with the frequency of someone for whom sleep had become reliable rather than provisional. And this was not a dramatic transformation and was not announced and was, in its unannounced ordinariness, one of the most significant things he'd witnessed. His own sleep was different too. He couldn't have precisely said when it changed. At some point, the ceiling above his bed had stopped being a surface he calculated against, and had started being simply a ceiling. One evening in May, he came upstairs and found her door open, and looked in, and she was on the floor with her back against the bed and a canvas propped against the wall. Not the small travel canvases from Blackthorn, but a proper size, 3 feet by 4, and she was looking at it with the unself-conscious absorption he'd first seen through her open door in the manor, and the painting was, he couldn't fully see it from the doorway, coastal, he thought, gray and blue and a line of something at the horizon that might have been light or might have been weather moving in. He didn't interrupt. He went downstairs and made dinner, and after a while she came down with paint on her forearm and her hair loose, and she sat at the table and ate without having to be called, which was a relatively recent development that he'd also not mentioned because some things didn't need to be mentioned to be registered. "It's the harbor," she said about the painting, looking east, the light at about 4 o'clock. She reached for the water glass. "I'm not sure about the horizon yet." What's wrong with it? Nothing's wrong with it. I'm not sure what's true about it yet. She drank. Painting the horizon is a specific problem. You're painting the boundary between two things, and you have to decide how much attention to give the boundary and how much to give what's on either side of it. He thought about that. What have you decided? She looked at the table and then looked at him. I think you give most of the attention to what's on either side, she said, and you let the boundary be what it is, just a line. It doesn't need to be the important part. He held her gaze across the table. All right, he said. She nodded once, the way she'd nodded at the beginning of things, and then she was eating again, and outside the harbor was going dark with the May evening, and somewhere a boat was coming in late, and the sounds of the working waterfront drifted through the window they'd left open for the air she had. Summer came the way summers come to the Maine coast. Slowly, then all at once. The harbor filled with seasonal boats and the town expanded by degrees, and then contracted again when the weather shifted, and through all of it Cassian and Seraphina existed in the town at the pace of people who had chosen it, not arrived in it, and the difference was visible in small ways to anyone paying attention. He ran his business affairs from the desk by the window, the structure of it simplified now, the edges of it cleaner. He'd divested certain interests in the year following the federal proceedings, not because he'd been required to, but because the inventory of what he'd built and why had been, in the course of the legal process, fully examined, and some of it had not looked the same on examination as it had in the building. He kept what was legitimate. He closed what wasn't. The process had been expensive and had been worth the cost. He didn't entirely know what kind of man he was on the other side of it. He was working that out with the same systematic patience he'd applied to everything else, which was probably not the most emotionally sophisticated approach, but was the approach he had, and it seemed to be producing results. On a Saturday evening in July, he found her on the back deck that overlooked the narrow strip of beach below the house, barefoot on the weathered wood, watching the water. The tide was going out, the beach extending slowly, the light at a low angle that turned everything the color of something worth keeping. She didn't hear him come out, and for a moment he stood in the doorway and looked at her, at the set of her shoulders, which was the set of someone who is not braced for anything, who has put down the anticipation of impact that had been her default physical posture for as long as he'd known her. The ease of it was still something he occasionally noticed, the way you notice a chronic absence of pain. She turned and saw him and didn't flinch and didn't arrange her expression, just looked at him with the direct present quality that was, he had come to understand, her actual face, the face she'd had before everything, and that had survived everything, intact under all the careful construction, waiting. He came and stood beside her, and they both looked at the water. I've been thinking, she said after a while. About what? About what I want to do. She paused. Not in the abstract. Practically. The testimony is done. The legal process is... It's moving without me now. It doesn't need me in the same way. I've been painting. A pause. I want to do something with the painting. I don't mean sell it, necessarily. I mean do something with it that's in the world. All right, he said. There's a community arts program in town. They work with kids, mostly, and they've been looking for someone to run the studio component. She looked at him sideways. It doesn't pay much. That's irrelevant, he said. I know it's irrelevant. I'm mentioning it because... She stopped, and a small line appeared between her brows, the look of someone working out how to say something true. Because for a long time, everything I did was determined by what other people needed from me, and I'm trying to learn the difference between someone telling me a thing doesn't matter and someone telling me a thing doesn't matter to them, but that I'm allowed to have it matter to me. She looked at him. Does that make sense? Yes, he said. So I'm telling you it doesn't pay much, not because I need your permission, but because I want you to know it matters to me. He looked at her in the July evening light, at the woman who had been introduced to him as collateral damage, and had turned out to be, underneath everything that had been done to her and around her, and in spite of her, the most structurally sound person he'd ever known. Not because nothing had broken. Things had broken. But because she had, through 15 years of bad circumstances and lonely survival, maintained something at the center that the circumstances hadn't reached, and she was standing on a deck in Maine in bare feet telling him what mattered to her, which was its own kind of structural integrity. It matters, he said. Do it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the water. They stood together on the deck while the tide went out. the evening light moving across the surface of the water the way light moves when it has all the time it needs, and the sounds of the harbor drifted around them, and neither of them spoke for a long time. And the silence was the particular silence of two people who have stopped waiting for the next thing and have started, by degrees, to be where they are. Eventually she said, "You're thinking about your father." He looked at the water, yes. "Is that okay?" "It's just what it is," he said. "It's not going to stop being what it is." She nodded slowly. "No," she said, "but it changes. The shape of it." "Yes." He paused. "It changes." Below the deck, the tide had pulled back far enough to expose a long strip of smooth, wet sand, dark and clean and reflecting the sky. A bird worked the water's edge with the focused industry of something that simply does what it does without needing it to mean anything, and the evening moved around all of it. And in the west, the sun was finishing its work for the day in colors that nobody would have the right words for, but that both of them saw and held for the few minutes they were there before the sky changed. He thought about revenge, about the 11 years of it, about the clean, cold architecture of a plan built in grief's image, and how he had arrived at the end of that plan and found something entirely different waiting. Not the resolution he'd constructed, not the specific satisfaction of accounts settled, but something that was neither of those things and was, in the way of things that arrive without being planned for, more actual than either. He thought about a phone call in a hospital waiting room and a sentence about dinner on a Sunday that had never happened. And he thought about how you carry something like that, and how carrying it looks different when you are standing next to someone who understands, from the inside of their own experience, what things that don't go away feel like and how you keep moving regardless. He didn't say any of that. It wasn't the kind of thing that needed to be said between the two of them. It had the quality of something that was already understood, had been understood for a while, in the way that some things are communicated without language between people who have been paying close enough attention to each other. Seraphina reached and put her hand over his where it rested on the deck railing. No ceremony to it. Just a hand, warm and present, the scars on her wrist visible in the evening light, not hidden, not displayed, simply there as part of the thing that was her. He turned his hand over and held hers. They stayed there until the light was gone and the harbor went dark with the evening, and the first stars came out over the water, cold and specific and very far away and entirely themselves. And inside the house behind them was a room with north-facing light, where a canvas stood unfinished against the wall with a horizon that was still being decided, and a desk by a window where the work of building something real continued at its own pace. And two people on a deck and bare feet above the receding tide, who had come to this place from the wreckage of everything they'd been told they were and had found, in the quiet of it, what they actually were, which was enough. Which was, it turned out, what enough felt like.